The man sitting in the courtroom looked calm. Too calm. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, his face expressionless behind wire-rimmed glasses. He wore an orange prison jumpsuit, but he sat with the posture of someone attending a business meeting. For 20 years, Dennis Rader believed he was untouchable. The BTK Killer. Bind, torture, kill. 10 victims. Decades of terror. And then, silence. He had simply stopped, vanishing into normal life like smoke disappearing into air. But when prosecutors opened the evidence boxes that day in 2005, something changed in his face. A flicker, a crack in the mask. Inside those boxes were drawings, photographs, journals, bondage sketches, souvenirs from every single victim. His secret trophy room, the place where he relived his crimes for 2 decades, had been found. Every sick fantasy he had drawn, every photograph he had taken of himself dressed in his victim's clothing, every newspaper clipping he had saved about his own murders, all of it laid out in a Kansas courtroom for the world to see. And in this moment, captured on camera, you can see the exact second Dennis Rader realizes his life is over. How did a church-going compliance officer, a husband and father, hide a trophy room filled with evidence of murder in his own home for 20 years? Why did he stop killing in 1991, only to resurface 13 years later? And what mistake finally exposed the monster hiding in plain sight? This is the story of how arrogance destroyed a serial killer. January 15th, 1974. Wichita, Kansas. The Otero family was preparing for a normal Tuesday. Joseph Otero, 38, worked for an Air Force contract company. His wife Julie was 34. They had 5 children. That morning, 2 of them, Joseph Jr., 9, and Josephine, 11, were home sick from school. At approximately 8 a.m., someone knocked on their door. What happened next would launch one of the longest and most terrifying manhunts in American history. By midday, 4 members of the Otero family were dead. Joseph, Julie, Joseph Jr., and Josephine. All 4 had been strangled. The children were found in their bedrooms. Joseph Sr. had a plastic bag over his head. Julie had been gagged with her own clothing, but it was Josephine's death that revealed the true nature of the killer. She had been hanged in the basement. The killer had taken his time with her, positioned her body. This wasn't rage. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was something else entirely, something cold and methodical, something done for pleasure. The crime scene told investigators they were dealing with someone who planned, who fantasized, who wanted control, someone who would kill again. They were right. 3 months later, in April 1974, a young woman named Catherine Bright was attacked in her own home, along with her brother Kevin. Kevin was shot in the face, but miraculously survived. Catherine was not so lucky. She was stabbed multiple times and died in the hospital. The killer had tried to strangle her, but she fought back harder than he expected. He fled the scene when Kevin, despite being shot, continued to fight. For the first time, the killer's plan hadn't worked perfectly. And he didn't like that. Then, for 3 years, nothing. No attacks, no murders. Wichita began to breathe again. Maybe it was over. Maybe the killer had died, been imprisoned for something else, moved away. But in October 1977, the killer wanted the world to know he was still there. He called the Wichita Eagle newspaper. He told them to check inside a book at the Wichita Public Library. Inside the book, investigators found a letter. A detailed letter describing the Otero murders. Details only the killer could know. And at the bottom, a signature. BTK. Bind them, torture them, kill them. He had given himself a name. He wanted credit. He wanted fame. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9th, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas. He grew up in a working-class family with 3 younger brothers. By all accounts, his childhood was unremarkable, normal, maybe even boring. He wasn't abused. His parents weren't monsters. There was no obvious trauma that explained what he would become. But inside, something was different. From a young age, Dennis Rader had fantasies. Dark fantasies about bondage, about control, about watching women struggle. He later described these urges as something that started when he was a child, something he couldn't explain, something that grew stronger as he got older. As a teenager, he tortured animals. He hung a dog. He strangled cats, classic warning signs that went unnoticed. In 1965, He graduated from Riverview High School. He attended Kansas Wesleyan University for a while, but dropped out. In 1966, he joined the United States Air Force and served until 1970, including a tour in Japan, Korea, Greece, and Turkey. A military background, discipline, order, control. After leaving the Air Force, Dennis returned to Kansas. In 1971, he married Paula Dietz. By all accounts, Paula was a good woman, quiet, religious. She worked as a bookkeeper. She wanted a stable family life. Dennis gave her that, or at least the appearance of it. They had 2 children together, a son, Brian, and a daughter, Carrie. Dennis worked various jobs. He installed security alarms for a time. The irony was not lost on investigators later. He was literally inside people's homes, learning their security systems, understanding their vulnerabilities. In 1974, the same year he murdered the Otero family, Dennis enrolled at Wichita State University. He studied administration of justice. He wanted to understand how police worked, how they thought, how they investigated. He was studying his enemy. By 1979, Dennis had earned his degree and took a job with ADT Security Services. Again, installing alarm systems, again, inside people's homes, seeing how they lived, learning their routines, and all the while, he was killing. After the Otero murders and Catherine Bright's death in 1974, BTK went quiet for 3 years, but he wasn't gone. He was planning, watching, choosing. On December 8, 1977, he struck again. Shirley Vian, a 24-year-old mother of 3 young children, was home when someone knocked on her door. The man claimed to be a private detective. Once inside, he revealed his true intentions. He locked Shirley's children in the bathroom, telling them to stay quiet. Then he strangled Shirley to death in her own bedroom, while her children waited, terrified, just feet away. 3 months later, in March 1978, he killed again. Nancy Fox, 25, was alone in her home when BTK broke in. He cut her phone line first, then he waited for her. When she came home, he was already inside. He strangled her with a belt. After she was dead, he called 911 himself from a payphone. He reported the murder. He wanted them to find her. He wanted credit. The operator asked for his location. He refused to give it. He just wanted them to know. I did this. Investigators were desperate. The community was terrified. Women started sleeping with weapons. Neighborhoods organized watch groups. But BTK was always one step ahead. And then, in April 1979, he killed again. Anna Williams, 63, was supposed to be home, but she wasn't. BTK had broken into her house, ready to kill her, but she was out. So, he waited, and waited, but she didn't return when he expected. Eventually, he gave up and left. But he took souvenirs, items from her home, and later, he sent her a poem. A sick, taunting poem describing what he had planned to do to her. Anna Williams lived the rest of her life knowing a serial killer had been inside her home, waiting for her in the dark. After that near miss, BTK stopped. Not permanently, but for years. Investigators didn't know if he was dead, in prison, or just biding his time. The answer was simpler. He was living his life. Dennis Rader, the family man, the churchgoer, the Cub Scout leader. He coached his son's baseball team. He attended Christ Lutheran Church every Sunday. He was elected president of the church council. His neighbors liked him. His coworkers thought he was a little rigid, a little obsessed with rules, but harmless. No one suspected. No one knew that in his home office, hidden away from his family, was a locked cabinet. Inside that cabinet were drawings, photographs, items taken from victims, newspaper clippings, a shrine to his secret life. In 1985, after a 6-year gap, BTK returned. Maureen Hedge, 53, lived just 6 houses away from Dennis Rader. She was his neighbor. He knew her schedule. He knew when she would be alone. On April 27, 1985, he broke into her home, strangled her, and then did something new. He took her body. He drove her to his church, Christ Lutheran Church, and photographed her body in the basement. He posed her. He took his time. Then he dumped her body in a ditch outside of town. The photographs he kept, added to his collection. 1 year later, in September 1986, he killed Vicky Vegerle, 28, in her home. He posed as a telephone repairman to gain entry. He strangled her while her young son was in the next room. Her husband came home and found her. BTK had been gone for less than an hour. In January 1991, he killed for the final time. Dolores Davis, 62, was strangled in her home. BTK took her body and dumped it under a bridge. He kept her driver's license. He kept a nightgown. He kept photographs. And then Dennis Rader stopped killing. Completely. For 13 years, BTK went silent. No murders, no letters, no contact. Investigators believed he was dead. The case went cold. Resources were redirected. The file gathered dust. But Dennis Rader wasn't dead. He was living in Park City, a suburb of Wichita. He had a new job. In 1991, the same year he killed Dolores Davis, Dennis Rader became a compliance officer for Park City. His job was to enforce city ordinances. He measured people's grass. He cited them for unkempt yards. He trapped their dogs. He wrote tickets. He was hated by many in the community for his rigid, authoritarian approach to petty rules. But he loved it. The control, the authority, the power to make people obey. His co-workers described him as insufferable, a stickler for rules, condescending, rude, but never dangerous, never threatening, just annoying. At home, his marriage was stable but cold. Paula didn't ask questions. She managed the household, she went to church, she raised the kids. Dennis had his office, his space, his secrets. Their daughter, Carrie, would later describe her father as distant, controlling, obsessed with rules and order. But she never suspected what he truly was. The years passed. 1995, 2000, 2003. BTK faded from public consciousness, a ghost, a historical footnote. The families of his victims lived with unanswered questions. Why did he stop? Was he still out there? Would they ever have justice? And then, in March 2004, something happened that changed everything. The Wichita Eagle published a story about the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders. It included details about the case, speculation about BTK, theories about who he might have been. Dennis Rader read that article, and he was furious. They were getting it wrong. They didn't understand. They weren't giving him proper credit. After 13 years of silence, his ego couldn't take it. He decided to speak. On March 19, 2004, a package was left in a drop box at the Wichita Eagle. Inside was a letter and photographs. Photographs of Vicky Vagerle's body. Crime scene photos that had never been released to the public. Photos only the killer could have. BTK was back. The message was clear. I'm still here. I did this. Remember me? The police and media were stunned. After 13 years, BTK had resurfaced. But why? What did he want? Over the next several months, BTK sent multiple communications, letters to the media, packages left in random locations. Each one contained more information, more clues, more taunts. He sent a word puzzle. He sent dolls posed to look like his. Victims. He sent jewelry taken from Dolores Davis. He was playing a game, and he believed he was winning. Investigators formed a task force. They analyzed every word, every package, every clue. They brought in experts, psychologists, linguists. They knew one thing. BTK wanted attention, and that need for attention was his weakness. In December 2004, BTK sent a package to the Wichita Eagle that contained the driver's license of Nancy Fox, one of his victims from 1977. He also included a detailed chapter-by-chapter outline of a proposed book about his crimes. He called himself a serial killer. He wanted his story told. He wanted to be famous. Investigators knew they had to play carefully. They needed to keep him talking, keep him engaged, keep him making mistakes. And then Dennis Rader made the fatal error. In January 2005, he sent a communication to the police. In it, he asked a question. Can they trace information on a floppy disk? He wanted to send them more information, but he wanted to make sure it was safe. The police, in a stroke of genius, lied. They took out an ad in the Wichita Eagle. They told BTK that no, a floppy disk could not be traced. It was safe. He believed them. On February 16, 2005, a purple floppy disk was found in the parking lot of a Home Depot in Wichita. Inside was a file, a deleted file. Investigators recovered it. The file was a document created using Microsoft Word, and in the metadata of that document was a name, Dennis, and a location, Christ Lutheran Church. It took investigators less than 24 hours to identify Dennis Rader, a compliance officer for Park City, a member of Christ Lutheran Church, a married father of 2. They ran his records. They checked his history. He fit the profile. He had the background. He had access. They just needed DNA. On February 25, 2005, investigators went to the Kansas State University Medical Clinic, where Dennis Rader's daughter, Carrie, was a student. They obtained a PAP smear sample from her medical records. The DNA was tested. It was a familial match to DNA recovered from evidence at the BTK crime scenes. They had him. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was pulled over while driving near his home. He was arrested without incident. He didn't resist. He didn't run. He simply asked, "Is this about the murders?" His house was searched, and inside his home office, investigators found the trophy room, a locked filing cabinet. Inside were hundreds of items, detailed drawings of his victims in bondage positions, photographs of himself wearing his victims' clothing and jewelry, journals describing his fantasies, newspaper clippings about every BTK murder, dolls posed to represent victims, driver's licenses, ID cards, a nightgown, all of it carefully organized, cataloged, labeled. This was his private museum, the place where he came to remember, to relive, to fantasize. For 20 years, this cabinet sat in his home while his wife and children lived their lives just feet away. None of them knew. Dennis Rader's trial began in June 2005. He had waived his right to a jury trial. He wanted to plead guilty. He wanted to tell his story. On June 27, 2005, in a Sedgwick County courtroom, Dennis Rader stood before Judge Gregory Waller. He pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder, and then, in a chilling display of detachment, he described each murder in detail. He referred to his victims as projects. He described the Otero family murders with the tone of someone recounting a home improvement task. He explained how he planned, how he chose his victims, how he gained entry to their homes. He showed no remorse, no emotion. He spoke about bondage fantasies, about his need for control, about the sexual gratification he received from killing. He described taking Josephine Otero to the basement, hanging her, watching her struggle. He said it matter-of-factly, like he was describing a routine he had performed many times. The courtroom was silent. Families of the victims sat in the gallery, forced to listen to this man describe in clinical detail how he murdered their loved ones. Some wept. Some stared in disbelief. Some left the room. But Dennis Rader continued. Unfazed. When prosecutors presented the evidence from the trophy room, they opened box after box. They showed the drawings, the photographs, the souvenirs. They showed the court what Dennis Rader had been doing in his home office for 2 decades. And for the first time, something changed in his expression. The mask slipped, his jaw tightened, his eyes shifted. He had wanted to tell his story. He had wanted to be known. But now, sitting in that courtroom, watching as his most private, twisted fantasies were displayed for the world to see, he seemed to understand. This was no longer his story to control. He had lost. The families of his victims were given the opportunity to speak. Charlie Otero, who was 15 years old when his parents and siblings were murdered, addressed Dennis Rader directly. He described the devastation, the trauma, the decades of pain. He looked at Rader and said, "You are a monster." Steve Relford, whose mother Shirley Vian was murdered while he and his siblings were locked in the bathroom, spoke about living with the knowledge that a killer had been in his home, that his mother had died while he was just feet away, helpless. Kevin Bright, who survived being shot in the face and watched his sister Catherine die, spoke about survivors' guilt, about the nightmares that never stopped. One by one, they faced the man who destroyed their lives. And Dennis Rader sat there, expressionless. When asked if he had anything to say, he apologized. But it rang hollow. He said he didn't know why he did what he did. He said the fantasies started young and he couldn't stop them. He said he wished he could take it back. But his words had no weight, no sincerity. He had spent decades reliving these murders in his trophy room. He had photographed himself in his victims' clothing. He had drawn detailed sketches of their suffering, and now, only now that he was caught, he claimed to feel sorry. On August 18, 2005, Judge Gregory Waller sentenced Dennis Rader to 10 consecutive life sentences, one for each victim. The minimum time he must serve before being eligible for parole is 175 years. He will never be released. He will die in prison. The impact of Dennis Rader's arrest extended far beyond the courtroom. His family was shattered. His wife, Paula, filed for an emergency divorce immediately after his arrest. She released a statement saying she had been completely unaware of his crimes. She said she felt betrayed, horrified, destroyed. She moved away and has lived in privacy ever since, refusing all media requests. His daughter, Carrie Rawson, has spoken publicly about the trauma of learning her father was BTK. She was 26 years old when he was arrested. She has written a book about her experience, describing the agony of loving a father who was also a monster. She has had to reconcile her childhood memories of a man who coached her softball team, who took her to church, who taught her right from wrong, with the reality of what he truly was. She has said that she feels guilt for existing, guilt for being his daughter, guilt that her DNA helped convict him. She has also said she forgives him, not for his sake, but for her own. So she can move forward. His son, Brian, has remained silent. He has never spoken publicly about his father. Dennis Rader's co-workers were stunned. The compliance officer who obsessed over rule breaking had been breaking the ultimate rules for decades. His church community felt violated. He had been president of the church council. He had been trusted with children. He had led prayers. And all the while, he was using the church basement to photograph his victims' bodies. The pastor of Christ Lutheran Church later said the congregation struggled with feelings of betrayal and shame. The people of Wichita had to process the fact that a serial killer had lived among them for over 30 years. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a stranger. He was a neighbor, a coworker, a man who mowed his lawn and went to community meetings. And that realization was terrifying. Because if Dennis Rader could hide in plain sight for that long, who else could? Dennis Rader is currently incarcerated at the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas. He is held in solitary confinement for his own protection. He spends 23 hours a day alone in his cell. He has no access to his drawings, no access to his photographs, no access to the things that gave him pleasure. He has tried to communicate with the outside world. He has written letters. He has granted interviews. And in those communications, he still refers to his victims as projects. He still speaks in that same detached clinical tone. He still seems to believe that he is somehow special, interesting, worthy of study. In one interview, he was asked if he felt remorse. He said he did. But then he smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile, and it was clear. He enjoyed the attention. He enjoyed being known. Even in prison, even stripped of everything, he still craved the recognition. In another interview, he was asked about his trophy room. He was asked why he kept those items. He said they helped him relive the memories. He said when he couldn't kill anymore, the souvenirs kept the fantasies alive. He said looking at the photographs and drawings gave him the same feeling as the actual murders: control, power, domination. The interviewer asked if he ever thought about his victims as people, as human beings with families and futures. He paused, and then he said, "Not really. That is who Dennis Rader is, a man incapable of empathy, a man who sees other people as objects, as projects, as things to be used and discarded. And for 20 years, he got away with it, because he was careful, because he was patient, because he planned. But in the end, it was his own arrogance that destroyed him, his need to be known, his belief that he was smarter than everyone else, his certainty that he could control the narrative. He asked the police if a floppy disk could be traced. They said no, and he believed them. That single moment of misplaced trust, that one decision to believe he was untouchable, led to his downfall. The trophy room he had maintained so carefully, the shrine to his crimes that he visited in secret for decades, became the evidence that sealed his fate. Every photograph, every drawing, every souvenir, all of it presented in a courtroom for the world to see. The man who craved control lost all of it. The man who wanted to be famous became infamous. The man who thought he was a genius was exposed as a fool. The victims of BTK deserve to be remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. Joseph Otero was a dedicated father who loved his family and worked hard to provide for them. Julie Otero was a loving mother who cared for 5 children. Joseph Jr. was a 9-year-old boy who loved baseball. Josephine was an 11-year-old girl who never got the chance to grow up. Catherine Bright was a 21-year-old woman with her whole life ahead of her. She fought back. She refused to be passive. Even as she was dying, she fought. Shirley Vian was a 24-year-old mother who tried to protect her children even as she was being murdered. Nancy Fox was a 25-year-old woman who was described by everyone who knew her as kind and caring. Maureen Hedge was a 53-year-old neighbor who Dennis Rader saw not as a person, but as a target of opportunity. Vicky Vagerla was a 28-year-old mother whose young son had to live with the trauma of knowing his mother was killed while he was in the next room. Dolores Davis was a 62-year-old woman who lived alone and was targeted because of it. These were real people. They had families, they had friends, they had dreams, and they were taken not by random chance, not by accident, but by a man who chose to kill them for his own gratification. Their families have had to live with that loss for decades. Some of them waited over 30 years for justice. And even now, with Dennis Rader behind bars, the pain doesn't go away. It doesn't fade, it changes shape, but it remains. Charlie Otero, who lost his parents and 2 siblings in a single morning, has spent his entire adult life carrying that weight. He was 15 when it happened. He is now in his 60s, and he still thinks about them every single day. Kevin Bright, who survived, has said that he wishes he could have saved his sister. He wishes he had fought harder. Even though he was shot in the face, even though he did everything he could, he carries guilt. That is what Dennis Rader left behind. Decades of pain, generations of trauma, families destroyed. And for what? For his fantasies, for his ego, for his need to feel powerful. The case of Dennis Rader raises questions that don't have easy answers. How does someone become a serial killer? Was he born this way, or did something make him this way? He claims the fantasies started when he was young. He claims he didn't understand why he had them, but he also spent decades acting on them, planning, preparing, executing. He wasn't out of control. He wasn't in the grip of some uncontrollable urge. He was methodical, patient. He installed alarm systems in people's homes so he could understand their security. He studied criminal justice so he could understand how police investigated. He chose victims carefully. He planned every detail. That isn't madness. That's calculation. And yet, there is something fundamentally broken in Dennis Rader. Something missing. He has no empathy, no capacity to see others as human. He sees people as objects, as things, as projects. Psychologists would likely diagnose him as a psychopath. Someone who understands intellectually what emotions are, but doesn't feel them. Someone who can mimic human connection, but doesn't experience it. He was married for over 30 years. He had children. He went to church. He participated in community events. But none of it was real. It was a performance, a disguise, a way to blend in. And beneath that disguise was a man who spent his private hours drawing pictures of women in bondage, photographing himself in his victim's clothing, reliving murders in his mind over and over again. That was the real Dennis Rader. The rest was just the mask he wore to move through the world undetected, and he wore it well. For over 30 years, no one suspected. His wife didn't know. His children didn't know. His co-workers thought he was annoying, not dangerous. His church thought he was devout. His neighbors thought he was just another guy. The mask only slipped when he wanted it to. When he decided to send letters, when he decided to taunt the police, when he decided his ego mattered more than his safety. And that is what finally brought him down. There are lessons in the story of Dennis Rader. Lessons about the danger of assuming we know people, about the reality that evil doesn't always look like what we expect. Dennis Rader wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a loner living on the margins of society. He was a pillar of his community, a compliance officer, a church leader, a family man, and he was also a serial killer. Those two realities coexisted in the same person for over 30 years, and that is terrifying, because it means we can't always tell, we can't always see. The person sitting next to us in church, the person enforcing city ordinances, the person coaching Little League could be hiding something monstrous. That doesn't mean we should live in fear. It doesn't mean we should distrust everyone. But it does mean we should pay attention to the warning signs, to the inconsistencies, to the things that don't quite add up. In hindsight, there were signs with Dennis Rader, his obsession with control, his rigidity, his inability to handle criticism, his need to dominate. But those traits in isolation describe a lot of people, annoying people, difficult people, but not necessarily dangerous people. It's only when you add the other pieces that the picture becomes clear. The animal torture as a child, the fantasies about bondage, the need for attention and recognition, the belief that he was smarter than everyone else. All of it together painted a portrait of someone fundamentally dangerous. But no one saw all the pieces. No one put it together until it was too late. The story of BTK is also a story about the power of forensic science and patient investigation. The task force that finally caught Dennis Rader spent months analyzing his communications. They brought in experts from multiple disciplines. They used emerging technology, including digital forensics, to trace the floppy disk. They lied to him, telling him it was safe because they understood his psychology. They knew he wanted to communicate. They knew his ego would make him careless. And they were right. The floppy disk was the break they needed. But it was the DNA evidence that sealed the case. Familial DNA testing, using a sample from his daughter, proved his connection to the crimes beyond any doubt. Without that technology, without that evidence, Dennis Rader might have walked free. He might have continued to live his double life. He might have started killing again. But science caught him, patience caught him, and his own arrogance caught him. He believed he was untouchable. He believed he could play games with the police and win. He believed he was the smartest person in the room. He was wrong. Today, the families of Dennis Rader's victims continue to live with the aftermath of his crimes. Some have found ways to move forward. Some have dedicated their lives to victims' rights advocacy. Some have written books, given interviews, shared their stories in the hope that it might help others. Charlie Otero has become a voice for victims' families. He has spoken publicly about the need for closure, for justice, for acknowledgement. He has fought to keep Dennis Rader from receiving any platform, any attention, any recognition. Kevin Bright has also spoken about his experience, about survival, about living with trauma. Carrie Rawson, Dennis Rader's daughter, has written about her journey to reconcile her love for her father with the horror of his crimes. She has spoken about forgiveness, not for his benefit, but for her own peace. She has also become an advocate for families of criminals, for the people who are left behind when someone they love is exposed as a monster. These are the people who matter. These are the stories that should be told, not the story of Dennis Rader's cleverness or his ability to evade capture, not the story of his trophies or his fantasies, but the story of the people he hurt, the lives he destroyed, the families he shattered, and the survivors who found the strength to keep going. Dennis Rader sits in a cell in El Dorado, Kansas. He is 79 years old now. He will die in that cell. He will never see freedom again. He will never hold another souvenir. He will never add another drawing to his collection. The trophy room that he maintained for 20 years, that he visited in secret, that gave him pleasure and power, is gone, locked away in an evidence facility, a reminder of the price of arrogance. He wanted to be known. He wanted to be famous. He wanted his story told, and he got his wish. But not the way he imagined. He is known not as a genius, not as someone who outsmarted the police, but as a pathetic, broken man who murdered innocent people for his own gratification. A man who hid behind a mask of normalcy while nurturing monstrous fantasies. A man who believed he was special, when in reality, he was just cruel. The legacy of Dennis Rader is not the legacy he wanted. It is a legacy of pain, of loss, of families forever changed, of lives cut short, of trauma that echoes across generations. And that is exactly what he deserves. If this story affected you, if it made you think, consider sharing it. Not to glorify a killer, but to remember his victims, to honor the families who have lived with this pain for decades, to recognize the investigators who worked tirelessly to bring him to justice, and to remind ourselves that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it hides in plain sight. Sometimes it wears a mask. Sometimes it sits in a church pew or coaches a baseball team or enforces city ordinances. And sometimes the only thing that exposes it is its own arrogance. Dennis Rader believed he was untouchable. He believed he could control the story. He believed he could play God. But in the end, he was just a man. A small, broken, pathetic man. Sitting in a cell. Alone with his thoughts. Stripped of his trophies. Stripped of his power. Stripped of everything. And that is justice.